One of the most famous quotes by Dr. Thomas Sowell goes like this, quote, "It is hard to imagine a more stupid or more dangerous way of making decisions than by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong," end quote. And yet this is exactly what we permitted to the so-called medical profession and particularly the so-called public health for the last 103, 104 years. It wasn't always like that. Before 1918, there were far more checks and balances on these things. It is indeed a very recent phenomenon, historically speaking, that society allows individuals like Fauci to essentially experiment on large groups of people and then pay no penalty for being wrong. There are a few reasons for this, but the most important reason for why this is possible is because far too many plebs have awarded legitimacy to these charlatans for far too long. A shift in mentality is needed. Experts and trademarked science and expert and medical advice is, fundamentally speaking, illegitimate. And the faster more people recognize this, the faster our civilization moves into a better direction. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so now that enough people have moved into the correct direction when it comes to the Wuhan flu, and now that enough people are primed for this argument, it's time for the argument to be mainstreamed. You see, with all good things, timing is of essence. In 2009, at the previous so-called pandemic, when I first tried to bring this argument into the mainstream, I hadn't realized that not enough people were prepared to even conceive the implications of the argument. At that time, it was still too radical to make an argument that institutions such as the World Health Organization, almost all national public health institutions, and almost all experts who issue edicts are inherently illegitimate and ultimately wrong. The argument was correct in 2009 too, mind you. In 2009, the World Health Organization simply changed the very definition of the word pandemic in order to fit the swine flu outbreak. After in 2005, it had used another marginal cough to increase its budget and power. And with this new power in 2009, it tried to pressure institutions into doing the exact same extremist stupidity that you've all seen in 2020 and 2021. The difference being that fewer nations obliged to being stupid in public in 2009. Mexico was one of those countries that got into a lockdown in April 2009. Now, did any of that help? Of course it didn't, just like now when finally everyone is finding out about the extremism of 2020 and 2021. Just like in 2020 and 2021, Chinese leftism had something to do with it. In 2009, the head of the WHO was Margaret Chan, a Chinese national who studied in Canada as part of the CCP's outreach program and, yes, institutional espionage under Chairman Li Qianyan. In 2020, just like now, the WHO is headed by China-backed Marxist named Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who is, among other things, indebted to the CCP and wanted for war crimes in his own country, and more recently credibly accused of having delivered weapons to the Tigray separatists who've been waging a bloody civil war for almost 2 years in Tedros's native Ethiopia. So the argument that I'll be making is this. So-called experts are not only no better than your random dude on the streets, but they are routinely far worse than those and should thus be judged as inherently illegitimate when they make prescriptions, and their ulterior motivations should always be questioned because they almost never have anything whatsoever to do with the scientific method and almost always have a lot to do with the more classical things, namely power and money, but especially money. Now, in this first part, I will provide the theoretical or intellectual reasoning for why this shift is necessary, and then in the second part I will provide the practical advice on how to make this happen. The good news is that this is doable. The bad news is that the time is short, no more than 3 years. After that, too many will have forgotten. So anyone willing to contribute to this effort should consider starting to work on it, preferably yesterday. So, this talk is divided as follows. 1. Pre-1918 history. 2. What changed in 1918? 3. How it got progressively worse afterwards, with examples. 4. Contemporary public health and general experts' illegitimacy. 5. Legitimate questions. And 6. Some conclusions. So, pre-1918 history. Now, the history of mankind, and the history of health writ large, is full of doctors and experts and public health officials being stupid in public. But prior to 1918, their negative effect, and make no mistake, there is always a negative effect and virtually never a net positive, the negative effect of these illegitimate people was always narrow. By tradition, at least 1 or 2 doctors were part of the leader's inner circle, regardless of whether the leader was democratically elected or an absolutist monarch or anything else. Now, that tradition still holds true to this day, although much around that has changed, largely for the worse, since then. Before 1918, radical proposals by such people would have to pass mustard through the rest of the inner circle, take into account local autonomy of all kinds, the political and economic considerations du jour, and quite a long list of other factors. Also, there were quite harsh penalties to pay for being wrong. The Republic of Venice, the geopolitical entity that invented the very notion of quarantine, essentially disappeared because of its excesses in the field of public health. Oh, and because of its helicopter money strategy during the plague, which brought 150% inflation rate, which was something unheard of in the 17th century. Sure, the Republic continued to sort of exist afterwards, but it never really recovered and eventually disappeared de jure as well. Public health-related riots didn't start in the United States in Michigan in 2020, but they've been around for far much longer. In 1894, for instance, in Milwaukee, Polish and German immigrants raised hell against the health department. In addition to violence, they also used physical pressure, lawsuits, and 24/7 surveillance to get the health commissioner removed from office. After he was legally dismissed, the same protesters physically removed him from office and carried him on their shoulders till the edge of the town. Links, of course, in the description box for all of these incidents. Now, that particular incident in Milwaukee was publicized widely 70-ish years later because it was one of the very few incidents where the plebs were in fact wrong, or at least in part wrong. The health commissioner's fault was marginal and the disease was real. However, the plebs were correct in identifying the corruption of the doctors and experts and were entirely correct in raiding the hospital, which was actually killing more people than it was saving. And then there are, of course, the decades of use of mandatory quarantine for cholera, a very good example of public health being stupid in public, since the measure continued for quite some time after it had become clear, beyond reasonable doubt, that the measure was not just illiberal, immoral, and illegitimate, but also entirely useless, even if you buy into the mythology that public health is anything but an extension of tyranny and illegitimate governance. Then there is the so-called Chumnoi Bunt, or the Plague Riot in Moscow in 1771. In response to the bubonic plague, the authorities created forced quarantines, destroyed contaminated property without compensation or control, and closed the public baths, which, by the way, made the original problem, the bubonic plague that is, much worse. Similar to how lockdowns did the exact same thing with the Wuhan flu in 2020, because the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, in 1771, the Muscovites stormed the Kremlin, trashed the archbishop's residence, which the archbishop at the time was in many ways the moral equivalent of prime minister today, and in the end killed the archbishop, which was trying to flee for his life. Eventually, the riot was quelled using the army, but the rioters got almost everything they demanded. Trade was immediately resumed, burning of property was abolished. You see, suddenly contamination wasn't such a big issue when health and public officials realized that they can be physically removed. Quarantines were shortened, and with less terrible service, public baths were reopened and food deliveries were increased, and subsequently food shortages had disappeared. And fearing that they will be all killed in a rerun of the riot, the nobility was very keen on wrapping things up. So just 2 months later, Empress Catherine decrees that the epidemic was over, even though in fact, it wasn't over. It lasted for another 5 months after Catherine decreed that it was over, but the Muscovites had made their point very clear. The Muscovites in 1771, just like the people of Milwaukee in 1894, or the people in Odessa in 1830s, or the people in Leicester in 1880s, simply expressed what so-called experts are only learning now, namely that it's people, not the science, trademark mandatory. It's the people that decide, they get to decide when and how an epidemic is over. The Spanish flu, for instance, didn't end in 1918 or 1919. In fact, it continued way into the early 1930s. But the people decided it was over by 1920, and that was it. The common theme, though, of all these examples prior to 1918 is that the experts paid a price, oftentimes quite a big one, for being wrong. And they were keenly aware of this fact, which is why you see much fewer such excesses between the 1700s and 1918 than you were able to see afterwards. So, what changed in 1918? Well, 1918 is a bit of an arbitrary point. It's more like events between 1901 and 1926 whose generally negative consequences were augmented by the Spanish flu pandemic, but that doesn't sound so catchy. Anyway, the onset of the 20th century coincides with a spectacular technological advancement, rapid improvement in the standard of living, but unfortunately it also coincides with the mainstreaming of several terrible ideas, almost all coming from what Americans would call the progressive era. Now, every country has had its fair share of atrocious ideas, but it wasn't until early 20th century when the fashionable atrocious ideas started to negatively impact so many people all at once. The technological development, coupled with the faster communication, and that is to say faster when compared to the 19th century anyway, all of this led to the spread of terrible ideas that triggered a slow collapse in wisdom. For starters, it was the so-called efficiency movement, started in the United States and then quickly spread globally, first to industrial nations and then elsewhere. The principle of the efficiency movement was quite innocuous. The movement sought to identify and eliminate waste in all areas of the economy and society, and to develop and then implement best practices. The concept covered mechanical, economical, social and personal improvement. Now, that doesn't sound that bad, doesn't it? And in many ways, it wasn't that bad. The efficiency movement opposed corporatism, opposed misallocation of capital, and even made philanthropy much more meaningful. However, the efficiency movement assumed that experts are always right, and it also assumed that its ideas are good in other aspects than economics and business administration. Well, both of those assumptions turned out to be wrong, and we're still living with the consequences of not pushing back against this monstrosity back then. After the Spanish flu, there were, just like now, multiple discussions about what went wrong during the epidemic and who is at fault. Unlike now, however, in 1919, the experts were a bit more successful in arguing that the reason most of their edicts turned out to be useless is because the plebs weren't taxed enough to pay them lavish benefits and unlimited research budgets. So that's how you got microbiology institutes quickly formed throughout Europe and the United States in the 1920s. That's how you got socialized medicine in more and more places, and the myth of experts became institutionalized. The efficiency movement, which provided the intellectual framework for most of this, died down and was replaced by offshoots that are still with us, and the purpose of this video is to find ways to accelerate their demise. Offshoots such as technocracy, which is an offshoot of the efficiency movement whose ugly face a lot more people were able to see throughout 2020 and 2021. Also that period, the first, let's say, fifth of the 20th century, brought the dogma that still plagues us, no pun intended, but that dogma still plagues us to this day, namely scientism. The word scientism has two meanings. One, the improper use of scientific claims, and two, the belief that science and only science describes the world as it is in itself, independent of perspective. Now, both of these senses of scientism grew spectacularly from the 1920s and onwards. Chapter 3. How it got progressively worse afterwards. Now, before I say anything here, anticipating the complaints from those who are accustomed to excuse away the capital E evils of illegitimate professions, such as public health and the medical profession, I will say this. Yes, sometimes so-called experts are in fact used by cynical politicians or private interests to advance an agenda that they may indeed be quite far away from the original interests or even imagination of the so-called expert. So, for instance, did Anthony Fauci want to ostracize gay people through his entirely wrong approach to AIDS when he proclaimed unironically that you could get AIDS by simply touching someone? No, of course not. As much as I despise the man, it would simply be untrue to lay such an accusation on him. However, I do insist that by uttering wrong ideas from a position of power and influence through negligence should carry a price. Fauci paid no price for the harm caused to millions of people who were ostracized and then some of them violently attacked as a result of the panic he triggered. And yes, the ghouls in the media also amplified that panic, but we'll get to Fauci later on. Until then, let me show you this great gem which pretty much sums up not only just how illegitimate public health routinely is, but also how it got routinely more dangerous. So here's a clip from May the 27th, 1946. Just watch.
With the possibility of a grave infantile paralysis epidemic, San Antonio health authorities attacked germ carriers on a citywide front. With war-discovered DDT and special sprayers, sections of the city are literally fogged with the insecticide in the fight to stop the spread of polio. Every suspected spot is sprayed. Drastic cleanup is ordered as polio and allied diseases show alarming increase. Even streams come in for disinfecting, and in the parks precautions are taken to prevent gatherings of youngsters. Literally tons of DDT are used on this dread disease that attacks our young. Again, war, destructive and terrible, contributes one of its discoveries to save life.
I'm sorry, what? In 1946, it was already known that polio doesn't spread like this. But because it wasn't expert consensus yet, the authorities and the government experts said to themselves that some sanitary theater is in order so that they can show to the plebs that something is being done. Now, does that sound familiar? You know, we're gonna have you all wear muzzles because even if they don't necessarily help, would you prefer us do nothing? The problem is that DDT in those amounts likely caused equal harm to those exposed, but in 1946, just like in 2022, nobody stopped to count the victims of public health. And just like in 2022, if you questioned the spread of DDT like it's nothing, you'd be accused of being an insensitive schmuck who doesn't care about the suffering and deaths of children. Now, make no mistake, polio is a terrifying disease, but the constant exposure to DDT has been linked to poor health outcomes even in the grandchildren of those exposed. Oops! It seems that DDT has a negative epigenetic effect. But hey, at least something was done. Science was followed, and they all showed that they care. Now, if you paid attention to the clip, it also says, quote, "war discovered DDT," unquote. Translation: the military wanted to test things. Now, we've seen this in 2020 as well. In Canada, the military outright tested mass formation and propaganda tools on its citizenry for at least 9 months. This is widely discussed by the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, not by some wild conspiracist website. But it is also, unfortunately, not at all surprising. Why? Because the idea that experts are always right and the idea that any white coat is legitimate is what creates the fertile ground for such thing to even be conceivable in the first place. If enough people outright presume they are being lied to by an illegitimate authority, which is exactly what public health is, such monumental nonsense would never work and thus will soon not even be tried. But in Canada, the vast majority of the public trusts the science, again, not to be confused with the scientific method. Now, did anyone pay for the DDT experiment or the 2020 illegal military propaganda campaign? No, of course not, because the plebs trust the experts. And since there is no prize for being wrong, I have no doubt that, at least in Canada, this will be attempted again. Not so much in other places, but more on that in part 2. Now, let's talk lobotomy, shall we? The use of lobotomy to treat schizophrenia and other mental disorders was not just the scientific consensus for decades, but it even got a Nobel Prize for medicine. Laymen who disagreed with such depravity and outright barbarism were simply dismissed as uneducated fools who can't possibly know better than Nobel laureates. Sound familiar? The problem is that the laymen were right and the consensus was unassailable garbage. In fact, the whole field of psychiatry is full of horror stories throughout the 20th century in ways that make the 17th century shamans look reasonable by comparison. And those horror stories aren't even consigned to the past. The opioid crisis is a result of a mixture between corporate interests and blind faith in doctors and experts. The worst of it is in the United States, but that may also be due to the fact that the USA is finally talking about it and a pharma company has started to pay compensations for it, which, by the way, it is also very rare, but also a positive sign. But back to lobotomy. After the Nobel Prize for Medicine was awarded to Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz, the practice became the go-to for a plethora of mental disorders. Ironically, because history is always ironic, the only country which treated this marvelous scientific consensus with the disdain it rightfully deserved was the Soviet Union under Stalin. Shortly after lobotomy was made the global consensus on schizophrenia, the USSR banned the practice altogether on moral grounds. Now, of course, the USSR ran gulags, so it was far from a source of morality, but when it comes to lobotomy, even if for the wrong reasons, their scientific counsel was clearly correct. Meanwhile, in France, the use of lobotomy continued way into the 1980s. In 1948, Norbert Wiener, mathematician and philosopher, so not a doctor, he said, quote, "Prefrontal lobotomy has recently been having a certain vogue, probably not unconnected with the fact that it makes the custodial care of many patients easier. Let me remark in passing that killing them makes their custodian care still easier," unquote. Well, in 2022, killing patients in psychiatry is legal in Canada. Because this is what happens when illegitimate experts and cynical politicians meet and never pay a price for the harm that they cause. Now, how about electroshocks? The public is made to believe that those are a thing of the past. But they're not. Electroshocks, or as they call it, electroconvulsive therapy, is alive and well and routinely administered involuntarily, even though its observed benefits over a span of 80 years, mind you, are still short-lived and the side effects are disastrous. The seemingly unshattering belief in doctors prevents most people from applying common sense and sustains the complacency about just how deranged the medical practice really is a lot more often than not. Now, I could go on like this for at least another hour on how much harm the medical profession has inflicted upon society just in the last 70 years. Now, don't even get me started on clocks with radium, facial youth treatment with radioactive material, and the plethora of other harms inflicted onto the public via The Science is Settled. Miguel, my co-host for the occasional podcast, was saying the other day that it's likely that in the name of science and in the name of medicine might have justified more harm than in the name of God did historically. Now, I don't know if that's the case because I don't have the time to study that in great detail, but suffice to say that over the last 100 years, most definitely more people were killed or seriously harmed by doctors than by religious-motivated crimes or religious wars. But wait, there's more! Chapter 4. Contemporary Public Health and General Experts' Illegitimacy. So, we reach to present day. In the last 3 or 4 years, the public was bombarded with two big illegitimate claims from the experts. The idea that you can be safe from a cold by wearing a chin diaper, and the idea that even prepubescent children can be, quote, born in the wrong body, unquote. Now, we covered both extremely and extensively here on Freedom Alternative, so I won't get again into just how ludicrous these claims are if one just simply applies common sense and doesn't subscribe to the religion of scientism. However, I will draw your attention to this little clip. Did you know that white men, as in human males, invented women in the 18th century in order to oppress black people? No, seriously. This is what Scientific American is unironically claiming in 2022. Just watch.
While gendered social structures are ancient, a binary framework of biological sex didn't actually exist in Western culture until the late 18th century. Before, science recognized only one sex, the male, and considered the female body an inferior version of it. The shift that historians call the two-sex model served mainly to reinforce gender and racial divisions by tying social status to the body.
Now, what else can there be said other than... We're at a time when we find more science in a mosque than in a scientific magazine. There is more science in a fatwa than in the vast majority of articles on sex, sexuality, and so-called gender written in the last 7 or 8 years. And some of you may not like it, but I insist upon exemplifying. So here's Shaykh Dr. Sajjad Gul, principal of Epic Masjid Darul Quran Hifzi School, which is a madrasa down in Texas, explaining a fatwa on transgenderism. Just watch.
Please note, this khatira is from me. The fatwa is approved by the entire council. The khatira I'm giving right now, it'll be a little bit extra, so don't quote this from the fiqh council. The fatwa, as I said, is 8 pages long, and I mentioned a number of points. I'm going to summarize some of these points. And this is especially given the current climate we live in, where this issue is now being discussed and being brought into cartoons, and our children are being exposed. This is something that we as adults need to be very, very familiar with and know how we teach our children. So the first point that I mentioned in this fatwa, which is something well known to all of us, the Quran and history both teach us that there are two genders. It's not just coming from the scripture. It's not just coming from mankind. Common sense, logic, reasoning, history, and the Quran all tell us that there are two genders. And the Quran tells us that mankind has been created from two genders and in two genders. Understand this point. We are created from two genders, right? So Allah Azza wa Jal mentions that from a male and female, we created all of you. So we're created from two genders. And Allah also says, وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً. From these two, we spread forth multitudes of men and women. And the Quran explicitly says, وَلَيْسَ الذَّكَرُ كَالْأُنثَى. The male is not like the female. And our Prophet ﷺ said, women are the complementary halves of men. They're not the same. النِّسَاءُ شَقَائِقُ الرِّجَالِ. Women are the complementary halves. Half of mankind is women, half of mankind is man. The two put together form mankind. He didn't say they are the same. So we firmly believe that there is such a thing called sex and gender, and there is male and female, and that this difference is not just something that is imaginary or cultural. Because what modern society wants to teach our children is that gender is not the same as biological sex. This is what they're saying. That biological sex, you can be born male or female, a boy or girl. But to be assigned male or female, they say, it is from culture. It is from society. We say, no. The fact that there is boy and girl means there is male and female. And that we admit and we affirm that the male and female are not the same. And because they are different physiologically, because they are different from the DNA, you can take a cell from any male or any female and not ask who the person is and look under a microscope and you will know whether it is male or female from the DNA of that cell. From the cell all the way to the body, there are differences. Physically, physiologically, hormonally, there are differences in every single level of existence. And everybody knows this except in this generation. So because there are differences, the Sharia has taken those differences into account. And the Sharia has come with gender, not just with sex and sexuality. Gender, male and female, is not just imaginary. There are roles that are masculine, there are roles that are feminine. And the entire Sharia, from the first chapter of Tahara all the way to the chapter of inheritance, it is gender specific. You cannot argue that the Sharia ignores gender. Every hukum, or almost I should say, there are many hukum that are the same, but many ahkam are different. Many ahkam, many rulings are different between the male and the female. So we affirm that there are two genders, that these two genders are distinct and separate, and they are equally human. The one is not more noble than the other. This is our key point here. That both genders are equally human and noble, and in the eyes of Allah, they both have the same potential to earn Jannah. This is equality. This is real equality. They can get to Jannah the same. How they get to Jannah, what their tasks are different. Yes. But the potential to get to Jannah is the same. And that is ultimate equality. So this is point number one in the fatwa that we have, that there are two genders, and the two genders are real, and the two genders are not just a social construct or an imaginary cultural thing. This leads us to point number two. If there are such things as two genders, then there must be differences between them. These differences, many of them, yes, they are manifested in the cultural way, how we dress and how we act. But just because they exist in the cultural way doesn't mean it is only cultural. No, it is fitri. It goes back to how Allah created us. So every society in all of human history had differences in how women act, how women dress, how men do things. This is across and universal. So to claim that this is cultural and not from the fitrah, it goes against the experience of mankind. Therefore, point number two, there is something called masculinity and there is something called femininity. And the Sharia requires the male to act masculine and the female to act effeminate. If a male goes out of his way to act effeminate, what is called cross-dressing, what is called, transvestite, drag queens, this type of stuff. If a male goes out of his way to dress like the female, or if the female goes out of her way to dress like the male, by unanimous consensus of all of the madahib, this is a kabira, a major sin, and it is Allah's la'na upon this person. We have a number of ahadith. Our Prophet ﷺ said that Allah's la'na is upon the women who imitate men, and Allah's la'na is upon the men who imitate women. Now somebody says, hold on a sec, I cannot grow a beard biologically. Hold on a sec, my voice is effeminate naturally. We say, we're not talking about what is beyond your control. We're not talking about what you cannot control. We're talking about you doing something above and beyond, you going out of your way to dress or to act in a manner that you are forcing on yourself to act like the opposite gender. We say, regardless of what society says, we have our Sharia, and our Sharia says men should act like men and talk like men and dress like men, and women should act like women and talk like women and dress like women. وَلَيْسَ ذَكَرُ كَالْأُنْثَى. Regardless of what society says, our Sharia has this distinction. Again, to make it very clear though, some things are beyond our control, and yes, sometimes in some cultures, what might be considered masculine is considered feminine in another culture. Small list here, very small list. And it is true, the Sharia might look at this small list and say, okay, in this culture, this thing might be effeminate, and in this culture, the same thing might be masculine. Agreed, but that's a small list. You cannot use this small list to negate the overall reality that men and women act differently, dress differently, and go about their lives in a different manner. And the Sharia requires, not encourages, requires a biological male to act in the masculine manner, and requires a biological female to act and to dress in the effeminate manner. Now again, there's a gray area, things might change a little bit in some aspects, and that's fine. But the fact that there's a little gray area doesn't change the default, which is men and women act and dress differently. So this is point number 2.
Now, I'm sorry, but you don't have to be a Muslim to recognize that there is more science in what Dr. Sajjad Gul said in the Madrasa than in what mainstream experts and intellectuals are promoting these days. By the way, the Sajjad Gul has a bachelor in chemical engineering and a PhD in religious studies at Yale. So, okay, maybe I was a bit selective on picking this particular preacher to make the point, but Sajjad Gul's videos about Islam in English are some of the most highly popular in the world. So I picked a mainstream influential preacher to match the mainstream influential publication called Scientific American. But the point of this example is not to quibble on Muslims, but rather to point out that far from being a thing of the past, magical thinking combined with scientism are very much alive in 2022 as they were in the 17th century. The difference being that the scale of harm is much bigger. A crackpot doctor in Switzerland in 1888 killed 3 people, gravely injured another 2, and somewhat ameliorated a 6th in his attempt to cure schizophrenia. His name was Gottlieb Burckhardt, and he's somewhat the grandfather of lobotomy. Yet, even so, the spread of the harm was limited. Today, however, crackpot ideas, such as the one expressed by Scientific American, get billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies to be festered and refined in the academe, and also to be then physically tested on people, including on children. At least in 1888, crackpots would harm few people and would risk their money and their reputation, and routinely died in poverty. In 2022, crackpots harm a lot more people and are rewarded with money and reputation, and almost always die very wealthy. The third leading cause of death in the United States is medical errors, which is a nice way of saying doctors are killing people allegedly unintentionally. And I say allegedly because there is no reason to take it at face value that it's all unintentional, given the history of the medical profession. Also, the continuation of allowing these people to influence policies has consequences beyond just health. It has multiple economic consequences. For instance, remember the second-hand smoke scare that was used to trample upon the property rights of hundreds of millions of people? Yeah, the entire science behind that rationale was pure, unadulterated garbage. None of it was true. Same goes with essentially all COVID-19 related so-called public health measures, in reality just illiberal, immoral, illegitimate and useless trampling upon basic human rights. None of them had sound reasoning, least of all scientific, and basically the entirety of what the expert class said was not just wrong, but wrong at a level of magnitude not seen in decades. And just like with the DDT spread in the 1940s, the negative effects of that will be felt even by our grandchildren through inflation, debt, increase in crime, especially violent crime, and mental health issues, which nowadays are treated outright through euthanasia in countries like Canada or Belgium. But this also provides an opportunity that hasn't existed since the 1960s. You see, the so-called experts are terrified that the public doesn't collectively go to sleep right away, as it usually did every time the experts fucked things up. For the first time in decades, way too many members of the public continue to ask questions and be a nuisance to the career and prestige of experts, and that terrifies them. Here's how Devi Sridhar, chair of Global Public Health at the University of Edinburgh, puts it in a whiny column in The Guardian. Quote, "Many doctors, scientists and medical professionals have stepped back from the field because they decided that it's not worth the personal cost. Scientists I have spoken with increasingly decline interviews about vaccines on TV and with newspapers because they are wary of the backlash they may receive from anti-vaxxers. This has created a vacuum where expert communication should be. In its place, pseudo-celebrities are building major followings on platforms such as Twitter, where they're spreading insidious rubbish such as the myth that vaccinations involve microchipping individuals or that COVID-19 is part of a global hoax. This builds anger and resentment, and it does nothing to improve society or people's well-being. Unfortunately, many people now associate public health with restrictions and lockdowns. Infectious disease management has always been about identifying what's making someone ill, trying to figure out how transmission is happening, identifying measures to stop this before more people get ill, and developing vaccinations and treatments. But in many people's minds, because of the exceptional COVID-19 response, it's now become synonymous with the shutdown of whole sectors of stay-at-home orders and severe restrictions on mobility and individual freedoms, unquote. Well, yes. Now, I will address the part with insidious rubbish in a separate video about the C-set. It's a complicated argument, but the short version is this. Yes, belief that you'll get microchipped through the COVID-19 shot is rubbish, but from a propaganda perspective, these people will have to be integrated into a wider pushback and backlash against these illegitimate people, such as Devi Sridhar. In other words, those people may be weird, but they're far less dangerous than experts in public health in any country you want. These people, the so-called experts, are illegitimate, and the knowledge about that must be spread to as many people as possible. Delegitimizing experts is much more important than correcting some rubbish spread by 10 followers' Twitter accounts. Anyway, back to what the illegitimate Devi Sridhar is saying. She is terrified that more people than she could ever remember are now outright associating her illegitimate field of work with tyranny and unacceptable and immoral requirements, and that is a good thing. The very notion of public health is illegitimate, as both history and present day shows, and thus a concerted effort to associate public health with harm, evil, nastiness, corruption, and tyranny is a worthy and necessary civilizational goal. It's easy to get distracted with institutions like Chair of Public Global Health at Edinburgh University, or the WHO, or the CDC, or the Ministry of Health, etc., but ultimately, these are just buildings and papers. What matters is the people in them. So, Devi Sridhar is evil and illegitimate. Rochelle Walensky, Tedros Adhanom, Raed Arafat, Karl Lauterbach, Jens Spahn, Anthony Fauci, Johannes Rauch, Andrea Moldovan, Vlad Voiculescu, Marek Krajci, Mario Draghi, Roberto Speranza, Pedro Sanchez. These are evil and illegitimate people, and inherently the enemy, as they are responsible for untold misery and damage for which they haven't yet paid, but whose judgment is clearly possible. Remember, you only need 10% of the population to agree with you, and oftentimes you can do it with 5 to 7%. But you need uncompromising radicals. For instance, for my neck of the woods, I set the goal pretty high. You all go to jail, your careers permanently over, your names forever tarnished, and all, yes, all of those who supported you as well. Also, those who pushed this nonsense downstream on the food chain pursued relentlessly through lawfare. Not forever, just a few years until we flatten the curve. But more on that in the second part. So, in the final analysis, This is a great opportunity to change things for the better and inflict some consequences on the members of a profession that has become not only illegitimate but outright dangerous for the liberty and prosperity of normal people who've done nothing wrong to anyone. And notice that I haven't yet gotten into the whole corruption business, such as Big Pharma buying up doctors by the boatload or Fauci's dealings with China. And the reason is simple. If we go down that route, the debate shifts onto mere corruption. But the point of my argument is not corruption. All professions are corrupt to a certain degree. Corruption is part of human nature and can, at best, be managed, but never eradicated. The point of the exercise that I'm proposing is to outright shift the argument entirely onto the very legitimacy of so-called experts, with a view not necessarily to flatten them out of existence, because that would be impossible, but with a view to solidly take them down more than a peg or two, down to the level of experts in telecommunications, or even lower than that. For instance, we don't put the experts on telecommunications to decide whether we allow Chinese spying. No, we make the political decision on that and then put the expert at work to implement it. The same regard should be rewarded to the whole medical profession in general and public health in particular. Doctors should never be allowed to make policy or even suggest policy. No, you guys move 50 rows back and we'll call you if and when we need you. Until then, shut up and keep your political, sociological and economic policy opinions for yourselves. In fact, it should be license-revoking infraction in the medical ethical code to have sweeping opinions in public about which businesses to shut down, who am I allowed to visit, how many people are allowed to party at my place, and so on and so forth. In some countries, advocacy for totalitarianism is a crime in and of itself. It should definitely be applied much more often against doctors and other so-called experts. Chapter 5. Legitimate questions. Alright, so from what I said so far, a few legitimate questions can easily arise. I don't claim to come up with all, or even most of them, but simply those that are most obvious to me. Such as, number 1. Okay, fine, but what's the way forward? Do we just shun all expert opinion from now on? Well, no. All so-called expert opinion on public health, yes, should be shunned for at least 30 years, to give it time for a new generation to emerge in the field. I would put a moratorium on this if I could. Until 2055, no public health expert is allowed to talk in public about public health, at all, for any reason. Policy to be subjected to review in 2055. But okay, that's not possible, but what it is possible is that through a combination of persistent, unrelenting and uncompromising activism, active measures, lawfare and propaganda to delegitimize most of the current crop of experts. Now that is possible. Turn them into depressed laughingstocks and make it not just uncool but outright disdain-worthy, cringe and weird to take them seriously. If you say in public these days that you consult your horoscope, you'll be looked at weirdly. Well, that's the objective for public health experts too. They should be relegated to the level of astrologists and horoscope dealers, because their scientific expertise is, at best, similar to one of an astrologist. And yes, I do realize that I'm seriously offending astrologists here. For all their wacky beliefs, astrologists didn't trample on anyone's constitutional rights recently, nor did they mutilate children or lead to the killing of people through immoral, illegal and useless measures. So the equivalence between public health and astrologists is only in the science department. From a moral standpoint, obviously, astrologists are morally superior to the medical profession in general and public health in particular. Number 2, medical profession can mean medical technicians, like dental technicians, for instance. Is there a line, or all white coats are fair game? To this, I will say that one should judge them by the branch, but always collectively. So, for instance, dentists haven't done much harm over the last few decades, except for the harm to one's budget. Dental care has gotten really expensive. So I will say dentists should definitely be left alone. However, epidemiologists, cardiologists, psychiatrists, again, public health experts, especially those ones, as well as any doctor who was too publicly enthusiastic about the COVID-19 insanity, these people should be judged collectively, but still targeted individually. Now, I personally distrust all doctors all the time anywhere. No exception. I regard all medical advice as being misleading at best and an outright lie in the rest of the time, because statistically that is the case in the vast majority of the situations. There is a reason for why ask for a second opinion is, ironically, a popular piece of advice even among the medical profession. Doctors, as an absolute norm, are either incompetent or they're serving their own financial interest, the latter being the cause of the opioid crisis, by the way. But such a level of distrust is difficult to foster in most people, although fortunately the COVID madness has helped a lot more people to cross the floor to this position. So in practice, any increase in distrust in even a subset of doctors is still a win for civilization. Number 3. Is just the medical field of experts or in general? Well, in this video I focused on the medical field because this is where the best opportunity, politically speaking, lies right now. Unfortunately, the public is not yet ready to hear about how Keynesian economics is quackery and fundamentally illegitimate, and thus all the experts claiming otherwise are themselves illegitimate. Just like the public is not yet ready to hear how education professionals like teachers, university professors, and others of similar stature are essentially state activists and an inherent danger to the future liberty and prosperity of both yourself and your children. Yes, those experts are also illegitimate, and the world would benefit immensely if it would trust them a lot less than it currently does. But the practical opportunity for an all-out offensive on all experts just simply isn't there. For now, anyway. So what I'm saying is that those who recognize how illegitimate so many of these phony experts are should be focusing their efforts in a direction that is highly likely to yield results as well. And an effort at delegitimizing public health officials in particular and some segments of the medical profession and establishment in general is very likely to yield results within a shorter time frame. I mean, doctors are literally mutilating children for absolutely no reason, using far-left ideological talking points to justify these barbarian interventions. Why? Because they're corrupt for the most part. Each so-called gender-confused child means almost $2 million in so-called treatments over a short span of time. That's why they're so mad when the public, either directly or through politicians, institutes mandates that prevent such harm from taking place. This alone should convince any parent that doctors aren't to be trusted. Combine that with the lunacy enacted under the excuse of this fluffy cough, and there's a great cocktail in the mind of the public already there. All the activists should do is simply channel it to the right targets. People shouldn't be hating too much on prime ministers and presidents because those can be and are being changed anyway. But on the illegitimate permanent class of experts, that's where the people should be hating on. University professors, journalists, epidemiologists, public health officials, these are all people who are still there regardless of who wins the election. And that's why they should be the target for delegitimizing and, where legally possible, punishment as well. So yeah, in an ideal world, we'd go after all so-called experts and try to impose costs on them for being wrong, but we don't live in an ideal world. Yet in this world, it is possible for the first time in decades to impose costs for being wrong on the medical establishment and on public health. And yes, routinely the solutions are political in and of themselves. If you live in a smaller country, you should consider lobbying for more radical things like getting your country out of the WHO, or at least stop the contributions. Demand everything. Be relentless. The most stubborn and uncompromising, the most intolerant, eventually wins. And finally, Chapter 6, some conclusions. Now in this video I try to provide examples that show a trend, namely that the more people trust the experts, the more things get worse, not better. The more the decision-making is left in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong, the more likely it is for harm to be inflicted upon society. To prevent that from happening over and over again, a pointed but consistent backlash is needed. And framing it the way I did, as an issue of fundamental rights, as a legal issue to be hashed out in courts or other forms of lawfare, and an issue for individuals to start exercising their rights and freedoms, and in the process of weaponizing the state and politics against these charlatans, the individual would also increase his level of knowledge in the legal realm, which is also useful. Framing it this way is intentional. You will notice that I did not say anything about vaccines, for instance, and the reason is simple. It's not a relevant issue. It simply doesn't matter whether any vaccine is good or not. The decision on that must always be individual and with informed consent. As a result, the problem must be approached politically. Until 2019, these foodies had the goal to object to this strategy via the usual whining, "Wah, don't politicize science, man!" as if their totalitarian edicts weren't inherently political anyway. Now, thankfully, the Wuhan flu solved that too. Foolish as they always are, the so-called experts managed to score a spectacular own goal, and now even their fans regard the dispute as political. Which is good, because in the realm of politics, the rules of engagement are entirely different than the realm of the prestige economy and bribery for publication, which these experts are so familiar with. Saul Alinsky's rule number 3 is clear. Whenever possible, go outside of the expertise of the enemy. Those not accustomed to this way of doing things were surprised and also amused when they saw the so-called experts genuinely shocked every time we would win a court case and get their expert edict thrown out into the garbage disposal where it always belonged. From their perspective, it was a "how dare you" moment, because many of them truly saw themselves as above politics. But as reality teaches everyone, you may not be interested in politics, but politics will always be interested in you. And finally, another reason for why I insist on a programmatic, distinctly politico-administrative, revanchard and civil rights-oriented approach is because they themselves have signaled that they're terrified of this approach. Here is an example of them spelling it out. The New York Times, a former newspaper, May the 25th, 2022. The anti-vaccines movement's new frontier. Quote, "Instead of feeling confident about vaccines, a growing segment of the population may be primed to feel more anxious and doubtful about them, and that doubt may be seeping into their relationship with medical science or governmental mandates in general." Kate Williamson, one of the pediatricians I spoke to in Orange County, told me that because vaccine skepticism has become linked with patients' political leanings, many doctor-patient conversations are now much harder. Merely bringing up science at all can be interpreted as a personal attack. Eric Ball, another pediatrician in Orange County, is vice chairman of the local American Academy of Pediatrics chapter. He told me that when California passed SB 276 in 2019, which tightened the oversight of exemptions, he and his colleagues felt emboldened to push for similar legislation in other states. Today, just 3 years later, these same doctors are embattled. We're completely on the defensive. Now we just want to hold on to what we have. Perhaps most ominous from a public health perspective is that school mandates have started to come under attack in state legislatures. Numerous states have already passed laws restricting or prohibiting mandates for the COVID-19 vaccine. And in a few, including Ohio and Pennsylvania, bills have been proposed that would weaken school vaccine mandates or even prohibit them altogether. I'm not sure that the people fighting for these bills truly believe in them, but they're doing it because it's politically expedient, Jason Turk, the pediatrician in Keller, Texas, told me. It matters not to them that there might be consequences to these bills passing. None of these legislative efforts have succeeded in becoming law yet, but they highlight a broader development that's easy to overlook. During the pandemic, the anti-vax movement was able to springhead into the mainstream, Koltai says. I don't think that it's that taboo anymore to be vaccine hesitant, unquote. Translation: what these clowns are really afraid of is you learning and exercising your rights with an explicit goal of stopping them. Most of them have no idea on how to manage such a backlash. Most of them are very weak men and women who've been told their whole lives that they're some sort of heroes with their marginal nonsense that only their equally brainwashed peers would be idiotic enough to call science. Again, I'm not talking here about vaccines in particular. Now, that's New York Times' obsession, not mine. What I'm talking here is these so-called experts as people, them personally. Rule number 13, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Cut off the support network and isolate the target from sympathy. Go after people, not institutions, for people hurt faster than institutions. Now, how to do that? That I will explain in the second part, which will be the next video due for publishing tomorrow. But until then, I cannot emphasize this enough. What terrifies these little tyrants the most is the fact that people have been able to form coalitions across other divides with the sole purpose of opposing the illegitimate, immoral, and illegal encroachment into their lives by the criminal enterprise known euphemistically as public health. You see, it was easy to keep their crimes somewhat hidden, not only because they were less visible than in the last 3 years, but also because the opposition was small and divided. Tea Party libertarians wouldn't work with Hollywood hipsters, who in turn wouldn't work with conspiracists, who in turn wouldn't work with the politics, and so on and so forth. That has changed. So now the political opportunity presents itself. We won't be getting everything we want, certainly not everything I want, but we could get a lot more than it was even imaginable merely 5 years ago. And any encroachment upon the authority and especially the legitimacy of so-called public health is a win for civilization and a necessary advancement of liberty. And in the next episode, I will go into quite a few details on how you as an individual or you as a small group can help to bring that change in your community. Over the last 3 years, we were involved in such efforts in 9 countries, so I kind of have an idea on what works, what can work, and what definitely doesn't work, and it is country-dependent too. The bad news is that I got nothing on Canada. Too many of y'all over there trust the experts. That's why millions of y'all are locked into the country, North Korea style. Because this is what trusting the experts and thus conferring them legitimacy does to your liberties. The experts are not your friend. They never have been. If you understand that, then it's time to both help your fellow man to understand it too, and also fight until it's broadly understood institutionally. Public health is inherently untrustworthy, and everything they say should be presumed wrong and likely a lie until proven otherwise beyond reasonable doubt through sources and means that are explicitly not governmental. Ultimately, it's government science that has to be legitimized first and foremost. 99% of scientists agree with whomever funds them. The rest of the 1% lose their funding. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.